This is the X I'm supposed to clear out. Okay. In this program, these Strong's numbers are under this Tools menu. If you click on Tools, it says Bible View Options. See that?
Yeah.
And then over here, you have a whole menu, and the Strong's number thing is here. And you have to click that and make sure none of these are clicked, and then you have to apply it down here on the right hand bottom. And if you apply it, then it'll put the Strong's up there. And if you don't want the Strong's, you can click that off and click apply, and they'll just disappear. So that's the secret. You do have to apply it though.
That might be weird. Now those numbers, they're like hyperlinks. When I click on them, they're going to go to the data about, yeah.
This brings up the Strong's data.
Right.
And then if you right click on it and tell it to find it, it'll go over here and find it. And these sometimes, when I downloaded it, these were all expanded, but there's a thing right here above the book thing that says you can expand it or you can collapse it. And if you collapse it, then you have to come back here and click on the little King James. And we're having to use the King James, as I mentioned, because of copyright stuff. But you know, I don't understand that, because that Legacy Bible thing that I told you about, that I've checked it against the NASB in multiple places, and it's almost exactly the same. So I don't know how you copyright something that's already. I just don't understand all that stuff. But I'm not going to. I mean, whether we use the King James or not,
The
it's
process.
really immaterial. So we're going to just use this as our method. Anyway, we were last time down to, I think, number 4 on the second page. I think that's how far we got.
Yep.
So we were talking about noting the number of translation options, and what I mean by that is when you highlight that, the Strong's number will tell you how, in this case, well, they've blended the King James with the NASB usage, but I guess it's illegal for them to do that. Anyway, the NASB uses, for the word doulos, it has bondservant, bondservants, bondslaves, both men and women, and then it has servants, and then it has slaves, and it has slave, apostrophe S, and slaves, and it tells you in each case how many times they translated it. 58 times it's translated slave, and 39 more times with the plural, so it's the same thing. I mean, it's 97 times out of 100. Where did they say that?
This is a pattern
They don't. Oh, over here. The word is used 159 times in the New Testament, and 100 of them, or close to 100 of them, is slave. And then it's bondslave or bondservant. 12, 23, 26, and 8, 34 times. And then both men and women, I don't know what that means, whether it's bondservant or bondslave, but that's where you'll get an idea from that, how the translators are handling the word. But at the same time, you can look at that and say, okay, why did they go with this English word here and this English word there and this other English word somewhere else? Like, for example, the word servants. One time out of 159, one time they translate servant. Now you tell me why. That doesn't make any sense to me. Why would they go to the word servants in English in one place when they've been translating servant or slaves or bond servants every other time? I mean, go ahead.
So we're asking that question, is it feasible to see where that one time was?
Yeah, if you were to go to the word over here,
Yeah.
servant,
Oh, okay.
now this is the English, and so you're going backwards, but you have to get into the New Testament, and then when you do that, 42 times in Matthew, and you'd have to find it by looking at it.
Yeah, that's what
That's a very complicated process.
If you back to where you were on the servant word, doulos, it tells you one time over here in Romans.
First Peter.
Oh, does it?
Oh, no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
That's a different, you're in a different place.
Yes.
Are we talking, am I following you?
Well, a little bit ago, it's when you had clicked on that word, it had 1 in front of Romans for the count. Now there's 1 in front of 2 Corinthians.
Now.
Oh, you're not on the servant. That's right. You had broke that down to the word servant.
Yeah, here.
Right.
It's used one time, but it doesn't tell us where.
Because it's different numbers now. Account's different over here than it was a while ago.
Where is over here?
Oh, the Bible, under Bible book, and then count.
Yeah.
A minute ago when you were there was 1 count under Romans, and it was 1%, and now it's under 2 Corinthians one time. So I don't know what the difference is of what it.
2 Corinthians is used one time.
That's what it says, 1%. And a little while ago it was on Romans, it was 1%.
It's also in 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy and Philemon and James and Peter and Jude.
But that's the number of times that doulos shows up. That's
Yes.
not servant, that's doulos.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you'd have to look at each one of those doulos and see in the English whether it was servant or slave.
Yeah.
And that's all I'm saying is here is when you're looking at men's choices about the possible meanings of the word, and when they go from using it over 100 times as a slave or a bondservant, which is significantly different than servant, why? This just doesn't make sense for a translator to just go off on. I mean, if it was a bond slave 100 times, why isn't it a bond slave that one time? Because there's probably nothing in the text that would say that this is not a servant, it's a bond slave. Because those two words are different in English. But I just mentioned this so that you can ask this question. Look at all the translation. We're in 4B on the second page. Look at all the translation options to see if any one of them will actually eliminate the need for the rest of them. So you could either use bondservant or slave. The slave is the way they opted for the word slaves 58 times, and then one more time because that's just a possessive case, and then this is plural for 39 more times, so 40 and 58 is 98 times they use the word slave. And up here the bond slave is 8 times and 3 times, and 8 more times if it's both men and women bond slaves. So bondservant is only used 23 times. I mean, that's the way they decided to translate it. And I think back when you were doing that study in Luke, I think that the real issue there is that in the Old Testament there was a distinction among slaves, because if a guy lost his financial capacity and he had to sell himself to somebody in order to be able to eat and whatever, he could do that, but at year Jubilee, he would automatically go out free. Or if he somehow came up with enough financial stuff to buy himself out. He could buy himself out of his bondage. But the other kind of slave was the one who said, I don't want to go free. I like my master. I want to serve my master. And there were some mitigating things in there, because something to do with if he had a wife, but the master supplied the wife, and the wife couldn't go out with him, or some, I don't really remember the details. But the point is, he would have his ear punched with a punch and then make a hole in it, and that was a permanent. He couldn't go out Jubilee, or he was a slave till he died.
And that was the bond servant that he had.
And that's probably the distinction that they're making in their translations, is whether this is a voluntary bond slavery or permanent.
According to the context.
Yeah, and that would be the revealing issue, is the context. So, but when you look at this terminology compared to Paul as a servant, what you're really asking yourself is whether he was compelled by his circumstances to become a slave, or whether he was a voluntary slave of Jesus. And of course, that is going to hinge a little bit on how you understand this word called. Because there are those who think that Paul on the road to Damascus really didn't have much choice. I mean, when the Shekinah is shining on you, you kind of feel like, yeah, I gotta do whatever. and when God told Ananias in Damascus to go to Saul of Tarsus and tell him what things he must suffer for my sake and for the Gospels. So, in a very real sense, he was telling Ananias, this guy's chosen, called by me, and he's going to do it. So whether his own personal volitional choice was involved in it as a voluntary thing, which on Paul's part, I would assume, because of the way that he did respond as an apostle and grew to love in such a way as Romans 9 says, where he was willing to give up his eternal location for somebody else's sake, if that would work. Of course, it wouldn't, but that was an honest expression of his own heart. Given that, with the backdrop, I would assume that Paul, on the road to Damascus, was not only converted to faith in Jesus, but he also had to deal with the reality of what he had been doing. And then he went immediately into Arabia for an extended period of time, and Jesus taught him the gospel and showed him all the stuff that he would need to be able to do the work. And when he came back, there's no indication that he was ever hesitant after that. Yeah. So I'm assuming that he would have qualified as a voluntary servant. But that's a theological deduction, and it's built off of these words here. You don't get the impression from anything in this introductory paragraph that he felt compelled, in the sense that he didn't want to do it, but he had to.
And that's why it's so much deeper than even just that one word. When I did that, I went all the way back to Genesis and Exodus and all of that, and had to read the context of what those words meant back there. And so it's not just sometimes it's not just what they thought the word meant.
No, it's not. And that's the thing about our introductory issues to any given word. I think the best beginning, obviously, I think, is to look to see if the translators were consistent, and if they weren't, why not? Because the issues of bondservant or bondslave, the issues slave versus servant, those are real issues in English. But when you're looking at the words as they're used here, for example, in Romans, there are 5 uses of the word doulos. The first one's here. The second one is in chapter 6, verse 16 and 17 and 19 and 20. So all of those are in chapter 6. And in that chapter, he's actually talking about Don't you know that whoever you yield yourself servant to obey, his servant you are, to whom you obey, yet whether sin unto death or of righteousness to life, or however those words are in those 4 verses. But in the text, Paul seems to be saying that we do have some choice about whether we're going to yield ourselves as servants, but once we do, then we're locked in. I mean, if you yield your members as servants of sin, well, then you become a slave to sin, and you really can't break the bondage by yourself. You have to have somebody come along and help you get out of that bondage.
And purchase you.
Yeah. So those are the kinds of things that our initial study, for example, I think that just these 5 verses in Romans is enough to give us some sense of what Paul really wanted to communicate in verse 1 of chapter 1, where he's introducing himself to the church and all the people there that didn't know him personally. And he's just telling them that he's in this slave-owner relationship with Jesus Christ. And what that means to them, he wants them to understand that that particular characteristic of himself is the foundation for the book of Romans. So because he is a servant of Jesus Christ, he is not going to vary from the things that Jesus Christ has commissioned him to do. That means that the words that he's going to write and the actions that he's going to take are dictated by Jesus. And to me, that means that he is really building from the very second or third word in the English text, a servant or a bondservant, however you translate it. That word actually means that his readers need to buy into the fact that he is representing Jesus Christ. This is not his idea. This doctrine is not his idea. And that's heavy. When you come to the issue of Christianity, in the book of Romans as the New Testament theological presentation of the faith, our position theologically is that these are inspired words of God that are authoritative, inerrant. But Paul makes them even more authoritative when he backs away from any idea that these are his words. He's a servant of Jesus Christ, and of course then you have to do the issues on Jesus, and so we're just inching our way into.
Now, how do I sort out in my head that NASB says bondservant and King James says servant? I mean, how do I deal with that when I'm doing my study?
Well, the way I deal with it is I ask myself this question. Were the translators of the King James and the translators of the New ASB, or the NASB is what they call that, I can't get used to that. But anyway, why would they have made that distinction in their own heads? And one of the issues is the 1611 King James was 400 years earlier than the NASB, which means that there was an enormous amount of more research done over that 400 years or so that may have given more insight into those words than they had in 1611. Because in 1611, they really didn't even have a Greek New Testament. They had some manuscripts from 2 or 3 different places, but the King James Version, when they published the Greek edition of the King James Version foundation, because the King James was translated often, they didn't even have the book of Revelation except for a little scrap here and a scrap there. So what one of them did was it took the Latin Vulgate, which was the original translation of the Greek text into English, or into Latin. They took that and translated it back into Greek.
And then in English.
And then into English. And so, that's a convoluted mess. But since then, we've had not only the discovery of thousands of manuscripts. I mean, I told you about a fellow that I know of that the biggest part of his ministry is traveling all over the world making digital pictures of all the manuscripts that he can find. And his goal is to get a complete record of everything that's available in this generation so that he can put it all together. It's an admirable goal, but it's a huge one. But my point is, it's a huge goal simply because there's so many new discoveries of the text in various places. In fact, I heard a guy the other day on YouTube answering the question of a skeptic who said the disciples didn't even write the Gospels. They were written hundreds of years after Jesus. And the guy said, well, he said, we have a scrap of a text of the Gospel of John. It's just a little piece, but it's datable, and the date is anywhere from 90 AD to 150 AD. And he says that's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, which means that at 90 AD, if that's the early date, then it had to have been several years for it to become a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. That takes time. And he said, so that pushes the writing way, it pushes it down into the first century, so John could have easily written it. And then you take Mark, which is the first gospel written, then it was written a good bit of time before the Gospel of John. And so we're now right down into the 30s and 40s and 50s. So, I mean, he basically blew the skeptics' argument out of the water because he was just blabbing something that somebody had told him without any validation. So, given all of that, what we have here then is simply a way to try to, this is a starting point as far as I'm concerned. You look at the way they used it and you say, well, obviously all those words have this in mind. The guy is not making his own decisions. That's the basic issue. Now whether he's forced to live under somebody else's decisions or whether he likes being under somebody else's decisions, beside the point. Somebody else is making the decision. That's the basic concept of all of those words. So if we had, for example, if we had a better English, 21st century English word that would communicate this idea of being under somebody else's decision making, a single word that would communicate that, then we would just throw all these out and shift that to that one if we were translating. I don't know one. That's why I have to take 40 minutes on 2 words to explain all this.
Right.
Yak. Anyway. All right. So, number 5, if we do a word study of the word or words involved in etymology, primarily in the book in which the text is located, that's Romans for us at this point. We find it in 5 places. A word study is simply a consideration of the word under observation in multiple texts in their context with the goal of attempting to get a feel for the meaning of the word. And what I mean by getting the feel for the meaning, we're all English speakers, and we've been speaking English all our lifetime, and we use words on a pretty regular basis that we've never looked up in a dictionary, and we don't even, if somebody tried to push us right to the definition, we'd stumble around trying to figure out how to express the definition that we have in our head. But we don't have to do that to communicate. We just have to have a sense of the meaning. And sometimes that's just intuitive. It's not something you've ever even thought about. It's just, this is the way we use the word. And so a lot of the backdrop or working backwards from that is simply a little bit more precision to help somebody else understand what your feel for the word is. And in Greek, we're 2,000 years removed from the culture. So to get a feeling from that way that the culture used that word 2,000 years ago, you just have to see it in multiple places, and by looking at the places, you can kind of get an idea what he's driving at, and I think that's obvious from chapter 6. If we go to chapter 6, the first use is in verse 16, and Paul says, don't you know that to whom you yield yourself servants to obey, his servants you are, to whom you obey? And he's saying, don't you know that being a servant means that you're going to render obedience? And when you yield yourself to someone to render obedience, then you have become a slave to that individual. And whether that's for sin unto death or righteousness with the implication that's under life. That's the concept of being a servant. And again, we come back to this notion. He's under somebody else's decision making. He's got to do or wants to do whatever that other person's decided to do. And even in the servant texts, like when Paul is telling the slaves to be respectful to their masters, even if their masters are really bad people, he's actually saying, do what he tells you to do. And the only exception to that is if he were to tell you to do something that under God you can't do. Then you have to say no, and then you have to take the consequences and go bald about it. I mean, if he decides that he wants to whip you 39 lashes because you won't do what he tells you because you can't, well, you just take your 39 lashes. As hard as that would be, it's nonetheless the responsibility of a servant to show respect to his master. And that's another concept of this word, is when you get down into his instruction in the epistles on how to live as a servant or a slave.
And the reason you said primarily within the book, you use the usage of that word primarily within the book that you're studying.
Right.
Is that because of the consistency of that author and that context?
Yes.
It's why you don't go, for instance, to what Luke said about it.
Right.
Because Luke may have a different presentation of his meaning for
He
it.
may have a different sense for the meaning, and he may be using it in a totally different theological or contextual area.
So you want to stay primarily within that author's work?
Yes, and of course with Paul we have a lot of,
Right.
but even in the individual books, Paul had a different goal with each book that he wrote. And you have to have that in mind too when you're
Right.
considering.
So that's why you narrow it down.
I tried to, and like I said here, when the word is used multiple times in the same book, well then you can kind of limit yourself to that. But if, and we're in C5 here,
Mhm.
when the word is only used a few times by the author, you have to look in other books. First, by books of the same author, and afterwards, books by other authors. So Luke's use of it, or James's use of it, or John's use of it will have something to say, but it won't be as primarily important as the way the individual that you're studying was using it, because you're trying to get inside his head.
Right. What did he mean?
Right.
Okay.
So once the word has been evaluated, this is in multiple texts, a sense of meaning will begin to develop because of similarities between those texts. And actually this morning that's already happened with me. I have never given any thought to a servant being summarized as somebody who's under the dictates of somebody else's decision making. That just came into my head this morning while we were talking. So that's how it works. Your mind is always trying to figure things out. And a lot of times you'll see an insight that just all of a sudden makes sense. And it makes sense to me that what Paul is saying here is that you're under somebody else's decision making. That may not make sense to anybody else, but that's just the way that's how our head and our minds work. They just flit, trying to figure out how to put this together so it makes sense. And we do this on the fly every day in all of our conversations. And sometimes we'll actually have a conversation where we make a fundamental assumption about what this conversation's about. Every word fits until it doesn't. And then all of a sudden you say, wait, I thought we were talking about, no, we're talking about. I have a brother-in-law who once had a Chrysler boat engine. And he twisted off the drive shaft. I don't know what he did. I think he broke the drive shaft. Well, my other brother-in-law had a Chrysler car. And between the three of us, we knew this guy that worked on stuff all the time. And we were having trouble getting the drive shaft out of that boat engine. So I called our friend and I said, we're trying to get this drive shaft out of this Chrysler and we're having trouble. And he just jumped the car, just natural, because my other brother-in-law had a Chrysler and working on a Chrysler. And then the conversation, he said, oh, you're talking about James's boat motor. Well, yeah, what do you think I was talking about? But that's how conversations can go, and you can have a fair length of conversation where all the words will fit the assumptions that you've already made and constructed for the understanding of the words that are being used, and all of a sudden something will come in from left field and you have to say, oh, wait a minute. And as students of the scriptures, that will happen particularly at the theological level, where we have believed a certain dogma or doctrine or theology point, and we hold on to it, and we hold on to it, and it governs the way we understand the words until at some point something comes in from the scriptures and our concept doesn't fit. And we've got two choices there. We can either jettison that former dogma and say, oh, I've misunderstood this all my life. Or that's the more comfortable idea is, well, I still don't understand this, and we'll go on to the next. But that's why we have so much theological debate. Because people are studying the scriptures and coming up with dogma or doctrines that fit some context, and they haven't considered the other ones. In fact, I saw a text or a sucker bait, what do they call them, clickbaits on YouTube that said, Colossians such and such is such a pain to Calvinists. And I didn't even look at the verse. I didn't care whether it gave them heartburn or not. But I just noticed that what was happening was that the people that didn't like what the Calvinists were saying had found a verse that gave them a little bit of heartburn, and so they were highlighting that because they wanted to prove that Calvinism is not true. So that's just, those are the things that we have to struggle with. All right. If the word has only been used once or very few times in the entire Old Testament or New Testament, just depending on where we are, we either have to do one of two things. We either have to trust the translator to have translated it correctly. If we do that, we just go on. We just assume that he translated it right, and we just go on. But we can look the word up in a lexicon, which is just it's just a different word from dictionary. When you talk about a dictionary in the language you're talking in, we call our dictionaries dictionaries for English language. But if you go to Greek, you have to call them a lexicon. Don't ask me why, I don't know. Hebrew's the same way. They have Hebrew lexicons, they have Greek lexicons, and they have English dictionaries. But as far as I'm concerned, they all talk about the same thing. And basically what they're talking about is the entire process that dictionary publishers go through. They hire people to go through all kinds of speech and written stuff and pick out the same word everywhere it's used, and then they come up with the definition and they give you the translation options or the meanings. It's not really a translation option, it's a meaning option, but that's what the dictionary is. It just gives you the meaning options that's in the culture as far as they know. And once a word is being used in the culture enough times, it'll find its way into the dictionary. Simply because that's the lexicographer's job, and we call them lexicographers even though we're working on dictionaries. So, okay?
Well, I noticed in some, like in Bible Hub, they'll always also give you a lot of usage from not biblical authors. Right.
Yes.
Early authors that were writing at the same time, and it gives you their usage too, which kind of sometimes helps me decide what the meaning was at the time that they wrote.
Right, because the authors of the text know that if they're not using the word, they have to make a distinction in their writing in order for their readers not to just go along with whatever cultural concept. In fact, when I was in seminary, well, actually, when I was in Bible college, I was far more enthusiastic back then. I bought the Liddell Scott, the Liddell Scott Dictionary of the Greek language. Every use of every Greek word that they were aware of when they published it. It's this thick. It's bigger than a catalog, and it's printed in some probably number 4, number 6 font, real tiny, with multiple columns on each page. It's exhaustive. That's what they call it, exhaustive, but it's because of exhaustion. My point is, that dictionary will actually give the word, it'll give where it's used in the Greek language, and it'll date the author. So then you can say, oh, well, he was 300 years before Paul,
Right.
or he was 200 years after Paul, and then you kind of have to say, well, was the word being consistent and whatnot. So those are good helps, but you have to know what they're containing in order for them to be helpful.
You know, now we complain a lot about changing definitions and the culture taking over a word.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that happened in ancient?
To a lesser degree, but yes, it happens. I mean,
It's accelerated now, but
yes.
because of internet
And the adversary knows the value of changing the meaning of words, so he's been hot on that topic for thousands
Since
of years.
Eve in the garden.
Right. Exactly.
Did he really say it?
And the issue
He
of,
changed a whole lot, didn't he?
Yeah.
even when he told, after Eve had eaten, I believe one of his arguments was, look, your wife's still alive. Your God said if she ate it, she'd die. She ain't dead. And then he bought into it. And of course, that all hinged on whether the phrase, dying you shall die, should have been taken as an instantaneous thing or over 900 years of process. And they didn't have any way to decide that. So, yeah.
I don't want to get off the subject or anything, but it's not really off the subject, but it's in another book. Can you click on Acts real quick, please?
Sure. She used 3 times this particular word.
No, I'm not talking about that word. Can you click on Acts and go to Acts 12:4?
Yes, I can. Let me, see, this is one of the neat things about this program, is that the chapters are listed up here. Which chapter did you want me to go to?
Chapter 12.
Okay, see, all I have to do is go to the top of the chapter, and I can pick my chapter. There's 12. What verse?
It's not moving your.
Oh, it's not moving up there on the screen.
Oh, here? Where is it not moving?
We still have Paul, a servant up there.
Your recorder's not working either.
Yeah.
It's not changing.
It's still, the timing is still running.
No,
Not
that
on the screen, it's not.
the cast may be one way.
Oh. Now what do we do? When did they quit doing that? What's it say up
There-
there?
Yeah,
1837,
18? And this is 38?
Oh, my.
20 minutes ago.
Oh, my.
I didn't know.
Is it running now?
Yeah.
Or what are the numbers? It's not.
It's still at 1837.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, well, it quit then. Something
Yeah,
happened.
yeah.
Oh, happy day. Oh, well. We only got, what, did I tell you we got 7 new subscribers last month on our YouTube channel? So I don't know whether it was you guys or whoever it might have been, but anyhow. Well, we're going to go ahead with this recording on here.
Yeah.
However, I guess I could stop that and start another one for your Acts question.
Well,
Yeah,
What was your question?
in Acts 4 in the King James.
In chapter 12, verse 4?
Yes.
Okay. It says, when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers. Is that the verse you're talking about? To keep him intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people?
Yes. And the word Easter is in there.
Mm-hmm.
Can you click on that word Easter?
Yes. That's the word Pascha. It's the word for Passover.
Passover. Okay.
So the King James switched from Passover to Easter.
Yeah.
But if you were to go to the NASB, after Passover.
Yeah, and the New King James says Passover too.
Yeah.
So they recognized that the 1611 guys had just stuck Easter in there.
Because that was the culture at the time.
They valued Easter, but they didn't value Passover.
Oh,
And we do, I mean, Easter is the last Sunday of this month, but I don't know when Passover. It's a little before, a little after. I haven't looked up the date. Well, I may have looked it up, but if I did, I don't remember it. But Passover and Easter are tied together in
Close,
terms of
yeah.
lunar and solar cycles. So they're always going to be tripping over each other, moving, flexing, because somewhere along the line, Easter got set on a certain, I don't know what.
Well, it's 6 weeks after Fat Tuesday, or 6 weeks, and then 3 days or whatever it is till the Sunday, yeah.
Yeah. So Passover is kind of,
April 23rd is Passover this year.
it's in March 31st is Easter, so it's almost 3 or 4 weeks later.
oh,
So what I'm saying is they're off on different calendar causes,
Right.
but they are the same event, supposed to be.
So
We
Yeah.
celebrate the resurrection on Easter. Well, the resurrection was 3 days after Passover, so.
right. Okay, thank you.
But that's why the word's used differently.
Yeah, and you do have to ask yourself these kind of questions, because in your King James, you're going to run into texts that give you the strong impression that you're regenerated when you're baptized. And you say, well, why'd they say that? Well, because that's what they believed in 1611. So, even our theology bleeds into our translation choices and stuff, and that's inevitable. We just have to keep being students of the Word, and over time, somehow God, the Holy Spirit, works out all the difficulties if we live long enough. And if He doesn't, well, when we get there, we get it all straightened out at once. So, yeah, we either trust the translators who have translated correctly, or we look the word up in the lexicon and trust that the lexicographer got it right, which means he's coming up with definitions in his generation for that, and he may or may not have been accurate. And then we have this note. Synonyms that arise in pursuing the data, and we need to note them and seek to understand the author's choice of his particular word when a synonym existed. And I said, note John 21, 15 to 17. Let me go to John. You're all familiar with it because it's one of the issues in the restoration of Peter after 3 denials. Jesus comes back and asks him, do you love me more than he? And he says, yes, you know I love you. And he used a different word. So let me get down here to where it's going on.
Well, we can't see it up there, so.
Oh, okay. Well,
We had no Wi-Fi.
is that what happened? Well, then I'm going to quit using that cast thing. I've got a cable right there that I'll just start using from, but we've already got 2 messed up deals. However, we do have the audio here. Anyway, the point is, in John 21, 2 interesting things in verse 15. He says, Simon, son of John. Now, in all the other gospel writers, he's the son of Jonas. In John's gospel, he's the son of John. And there's a connection between Jonas and John in terms of the English-Greek thing. It's the same guy. But the point is, why did John call Simon son of John? Or why did Jesus call him son of John? And John recorded it that way. Well, that's a heavy-duty theological issue because you know that John means Yahweh's gracious, and this was the shift from law to grace. This was the last gospel writing that was heavy on grace. And I mean, it starts out, John 1, that Moses gave us the law, and grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. So you have that contrast immediately in John's gospel. So that's interesting that he makes Simon out to be a son of someone whose name Yahweh is gracious, because he apparently wants Peter to think about being a son of grace. And then he asks him, do you love me? Well, that love word is agapao, is the Greek verb for to value highly. And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he uses the word phileo. Why? Jesus didn't ask him if he loved him with a phileo kind of love. He asked him if he loved him with an agape kind of love. And Peter says, yes, you know that I value you with a phileo kind of love. But why? Well, there are varying opinions about that, but mine is that Peter was still caught in his Peter concept, and that is open mouth, insert foot. And he was always saying things that were designed to promote himself. Always. I mean, that was his character as an unregenerate person. And even after that, as a disciple of Jesus, he was very reputation conscious, and he was very keyed on trying to be important. And probably, I don't know this, but it wouldn't surprise me a bit if he wasn't the one to start the argument back in the Gospel about who's the greatest in the kingdom. That's just me. But anyway, when he says, you know that I phileo you, what he's actually claiming is the kind of love I have for you is more highly developed than the agape kind, because the more highly developed love is this kind that where you're linked together so that you're bound together emotionally. Value is different than being bound emotionally. They include value, both of them do, but you can have an agape for something or somebody that's not heavily attached to your emotional well-being. But you can't have a phileo kind of love with somebody that's divorced from your emotions. So if they do something that hurts you, or they do something that makes you really happy, that's emotional entanglement, if you want to call it that. They're bound. And so I think that Peter's saying, you know, we're bound together. You know that.
He was above
the other disciples.
Yeah.
But anyway, so he said then, Jesus said, tend my lambs. And then he said the second time, do you love me? And he uses agape again, or agapao. And he says, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. And he says, shepherd my sheep. And then he says the third time, Simon, do you phileo me? And it says that Simon was grieved because the Lord said the third time, do you phileo me? Because that's really, Peter was trying to promote himself. I think, again, he was trying to erase the trauma that his soul went through after denying the Lord 3 times. And he probably swore to himself he'd never do that again. He was going to tie his soul to Jesus, and he was going to stay right there. But that's a different thing than agape. And so he was claiming that he had achieved that. And Jesus just, frankly, the third time says, is that really true? And then Peter shows it's not. In this text. Because he looks around and he sees John and he says, well, what about him? And Jesus said, hey, we're not talking about him, we're talking about you. So in the context, you get this feeling of these words and why they're being used the way they are. And that's what I'm talking about when you use synonyms. Because phileo is a synonym for agapao. But so there are a couple other Greek words that will be translated by our English LOVE words, but they have totally different connections. One of them is almost exclusively sexual attraction. So, and in India, I was warned before I went to teach in India to be careful how I use the word love, because over there, their concept of love is sexual, just across the board. So if you say something, you better be talking according to the way they're understanding it rather than the way we're understanding it, or just use a different word. And so even in the situation in the 20th century, when I was over there, I was being cautioned about these words. And that's what I mean about when you see synonym being used, you cannot do what my English teacher always did. And that is, she felt like, and this is high school, she felt like using synonyms would spice up your work. It would make you seem to be more capable of expressing your feelings or whatever that you're writing. And if you use the same word over and over and over, well, then she didn't like that. Well, to me, that's just her English teacher mindset, because if you want to use a word that means what you mean by it, you use that word. I don't care if you have to say it 10 times. And that's just me, though. But my point is that synonyms are different. And I use a phrase that I heard when I was in seminary. It's called a semantic marker in a field of meaning. A word is a semantic marker in a field of meaning. It's kind of like that microphone lying there on the table. The tables are the field. The microphone's only covering this much space of it. Well, calling it a microphone covering this much space kind of limits everything else. Nothing else is microphone. But in the word microphone, you're going to have another word that talks about recording sound. And you're going to have another word that has something else to do with something. And these are overlappers. These are going to be your synonyms. They overlap something. Nothing exactly overlaps, because two words that mean exactly the same thing don't exist. That's the height of redundancy. So every word, synonym or not, is going to be a semantic marker. It's going to be taking up its place in this whole field of meaning. But its place is partially being encroached on by words what we call synonyms. And words that are clear out here, they're not synonyms because they're not sharing any of the same territory. So synonyms are important because you recognize, okay, there's a shared part of the meaning here. That's what I said when I said agape and phileo both include value, putting a value on something or someone. But they're different in terms of other issues. So even in the Bible, I do not believe that there is a single solitary use of the synonym for synonym's sake, just to have a synonym. These are inspired words of God. Every jot and tittle are legit, and therefore, if he shifts a word like from Jonas to John, he did it on purpose. Because John's a little more clear about the link to grace than Jonas is, even though they're probably like this in terms of the field of meaning.
In that same context, you were talking about using words over and over, as Paul did in the book of Romans. If he was talking about a different kind of slave than a bondservant, he would have used a different word.
In fact, he did. The word deacon means minister, but it also means servant. But deacon is not a slave. He's a servant because he's being defined in terms of what he does. A slave is being defined in terms of what he is.
Right.
A slave serves, but a deacon serves not as a slave. So even in our theology of the church, deacons are the ones that are chosen to serve the church in certain ways, but they're in no sense considered to be slaves of the church. But they might consider themselves slaves of Jesus, and should, probably. Okay, let's go to, well, that's it. Number 6 is repeat steps 1 through 5. So we're down to the practice of the process, because from now on we're going to simply be looking at each of the words and figuring out what they mean, and then we're going to be developing a broadening exposure to a lot of When you're looking at a word in lots of different texts and contexts, you're exposing your brain to a whole lot of biblical information that may not be on the edge of your search stuff, but it's still going inside your head. And the Holy Spirit can use that later because He uses whatever words of Scripture are lodged in our brains. Generally, He does not create new words or new exposure issues. Sometimes with visions and dreams and stuff like that He might, but generally speaking, we look at the way the words are used to develop a concept or a feeling for the word, but it also gives us the opportunity to be exposed to a lot of biblical revelation. So the study's not narrow. It's a very broadening experience. So the seventh part is, after looking at the words the author chose to use, write out his sentence with the conclusions of your word studies. In other words, write the same sentence, but use your understanding of what he meant, and you may have to end up producing something like the Amplified Bible, where you have to use a phrase instead of a word. Okay?
The use of all of these words that we put together, like, they also, once you use or study those words and you develop your own, the way your own mind works. And so I guess the Holy Spirit used that also to develop concepts.
Yes.
And you go from words to concepts, and those concepts are used to build different
doctrine, theology. It's a process, and I realize we're deep in the weeds here, but the fact is, the more exposure we have to the bottom, the details, the greater will be the probability that we'll understand the larger concepts, because we're developing them out of these. It's kind of like studying all the leaves on a tree and then deciding what this tree is really. And you can do that, but it takes a lot more effort than to just step back and look at the tree.
And say, my daddy said that was a poplar, so it's a poplar.
It's a poplar.
In this NASB, as you call it, I looked at all the references in chapter 6, and I'm assuming that's all doulos.
Yes.
And every time in 6, it's in ASB, it's slave, not bondservant.
Okay.
However, in verse 1, it's bondservant,
Is it in the NASB? Is it bondservant in verse 1? Yeah,
Yes,
it is.
yes.
But every other place it's bond.
Slave.
It's a
It's just
slave.
slave, yeah.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting reality. So even the translators of the NASB switched from bondservant to slave.
Right.
And they may, I don't know why they did that, but I can speculate. Chapter 6 is about being
A slave to
actually
sin.
compelled,
Yeah.
whether you like it or not.
Right.
Whereas in verse 1 of chapter 1, it's probably deliberately a choice issue. I want to be this. He didn't have to identify himself as a bondservant if he didn't like the idea. Obviously, he liked the idea. Even James, the brother of the Lord, said he was a servant of Jesus. So they like that idea of being a slave to Jesus or a bondservant to Jesus. But the fact that they liked it means that it's not a slave, it's a bondservant slave. Okay, our time is up. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we're grateful for your word. We recognize we're wrestling with infinity, and it can be challenging beyond our perception of our abilities, and we just pray that you will enable us to rejoice in the good things that we find and let the rest of it go so that we're not discouraged or disappointed. And we do ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
I mean, in my head, I see